There are a lot of acronyms and technical terms when it comes to mountain biking, and it can all be a bit confusing. I mean, do you know your reach from your press fit? Or do you know your super boost from your Hyperglide Plus? Well, don't worry, because Shimano also thought it was quite confusing, so they asked me to make a video and clear it all up a bit. Okay, so let's start with the most obvious one, MTB. Yep, it stands for mountain bike, although in the early days they were often known as ATBs, or all-terrain bicycles. Now the coolest thing about the mountain bike is you can ride them on literally any terrain anywhere. They are the most versatile bicycle money can buy, so therefore they're the best. Okay, so next up, let's take a quick look at some of the most obvious disciplines out there, because they can be confusing between bikes. First up, XC, or cross country. Now this is about having a nice, lightweight, efficient bike that can travel uphill and down dale. It's all about having a lightweight bike, especially when it comes to racing. Geometry tends to be quite steep to get agile, responsive handling, and you can get suspension up to around 100 millimeters. So the next category are trail bikes. Now these are essentially slightly tougher or more durable cross-country bikes. They can have similar travel as a cross-country bike, or up to about 130. Now these are really suitable for every person to ride off-road, and there's very little that phases them. The next category gets a bit bigger. They're known as all-mountain, or occasionally enduro bikes. Now typically having anything from 140 millimeters of travel upwards, these bikes can climb anything that a fit and skilled rider can really attempt, and they'll also descend seemingly any terrain. They're probably the most versatile style of mountain bike because of the fact that it can climb anything and descend anything, and because of this they have the mass appeal. Everyone wants to have one, although not everyone needs a bike with this much travel. Now the difference between all mountain and enduro is simply enduro is a race format. The bike is essentially an all mountain bike, but it might have some tougher features on it. It might have a chain guide, some downhill tyres, some slightly heavier duty componentry, or even a coil shock. But essentially it's the same thing. And the next obvious choice is the downhill category. Now this is about as pure as mountain biking gets. It simply is a time trial down the side of a mountain. And this actually is where mountain biking all started, back in the 70s in Marin County, California, where a bunch of hippies were racing converted paperboy bikes down the side of a mountain. To cope with this sort of riding on modern day mountains, the bikes tend to have up to 200 millimeters of travel, which is a huge amount, and they have very relaxed geometry. They'll feel really sluggish on very basic terrain, but as soon as it comes into high speed and rough demanding terrain, these things really come to life. However, they are completely useless for anything other than pure downhill riding. There are two major types of mountain bike, a hardtail or a full suspension bike. A hardtail, as you might imagine, is based around a rigid frame and has a front suspension fork. A full suspension bike has suspension front and rear. All right, let's have a quick look at the basic anatomy of a mountain bike, starting with the heart of the bike, which is the frame. Every frame has a head tube, has a top tube, a down tube, a seat tube, a bottom bracket shell at the bottom there, and it has a chain stay and a seat stay. And then of course, driving that bike are a set of wheels. Every set of wheels has tyres, rims, spokes and hubs. The hubs revolve around an axle which is either attached to the frame or in this case attached to the fork at the front. There are two main types of fork. You get rigid forks or you get a suspension fork like this one here. Now most mountain bike suspension forks are telescopic in nature like this one. We'll get to these in a little while. Now steering that fork, you've got some bearings that are attached to the head tube and you've got a stem connected to that at the top, which the job of the stem is to hold the handlebars. Then you've got your control areas of the bike. You've got your handlebar grips, you have your brake levers, and you have your gear lever up there as well. If you're lucky enough to have a dropper post, you'll probably have a remote control for the dropper post located up on handlebars too. Now dropper post is a variant of the seat post, except has a really cool trick up its sleeve. You push a button and it telescopically drops. Cool thing about this, it means you can ride technical terrain without the saddle being in the way. Push a button, comes back up, so it makes it nice and easy to pedal. Genius bit of kit. Okay, and over to the back of the bike to check out the transmission and the drivetrain. So transmission, drivetrain, gears, whatever you want to call it, this is where it all sits on the bike. Now of course you have the crank at the front here that's connected to that bottom bracket axle. You're driving around a chainring with a chain and a cassette at the rear, sometimes known as the rear sprockets. You have the rear mech, also known as the rear derailleur, which is operated by a cable from the shifter that's mounted on the bars. There are thousands of different types of suspension bike, but pretty much they'll fall within two major styles, single pivot or a 4-bar. And the way to tell them apart is by looking at this chainstay of the bike. Does it have a pivot in between an axle and a main pivot? If the answer is no, it's a single pivot. If the answer is yes, then it's a 4-bar linkage. Now all suspension bikes drive a shock at the rear. Now there's two major types. You get the air shock like this one, which has an air spring on the inside, which is almost infinitely adjustable to rider weight, which is why they're so popular. But you also get coil sprung shocks. It has a big old metal coil spring on the outside of the shock, like you see on motorbikes. These are immensely popular with gravity fueled riders. They tend to be a little bit more robust. Now, also on shock absorbers, both styles, you have two major forms of adjustment. You have the compression damping and rebound damping. Compression deals with absorbing the impact of a shock, but also stopping it to move excessively under your body weight. Rebound deals with controlling the shock as it extends again. Now the geometry of a bike refers to all the numbers and angles that directly correspond to how the bike handles, and it can sound confusing. So these are the ones that you need to know. Head angle. Head angle is your steering angle of the bike. If you have a shallow head angle or a relaxed angle, the geometry is going to feel like a relaxed handling bike. This is great when you're going fast or riding rough terrain, but as a downside, if you're riding more basic terrain, it can feel very lethargic. And the opposite can be found with a steep head angle. On less aggressive terrain, the bike will feel more agile and responsive, but as soon as you start getting things rough or pointing it down faster, more aggressive terrain, it's going to start feeling a bit more nervous. So it's about finding what suits you. Next up is the seat tube angle. Now you often hear steep seat tube angles referred to as a really good thing. This is good because it puts your weight directly between the two wheels, good for traction at the rear end and control at the front end, but you have to have a proportionally long front end to allow for a steep seat angle. You don't always want that on bikes. On a lightweight cross-country bike, you don't want a super lengthy bike. It's got to feel responsive. Next up is the chainstay or the rear center of the bike. Short chainstay means the bike's going to feel very agile, very easy to get the front wheel up. A long chainstay is going to mean it feels a bit more balanced and has a bit more control at speed. Bottom bracket height. You have a low bottom bracket height or a high bottom bracket height. Low bottom bracket means you're going to have nice, secure, stable handling. The downsides though are the fact that you can strike your feet on the floor and it can be a bit tricky to get your bike into the turns. You'll feel great when you're in the turns because you're nice and low, but laying the bike over can be tricky. A high bottom bracket, you don't have the ground clearance issues and it means it's easy to pitch the bike into turns. A little less stable though. Okay, and the last bit you need to know is about frame sizing. Now historically you'd buy a mountain bike by the frame size measured of the seat tube. So it might be a 16-inch frame, 17-inch frame, 21-inch frame. That measurement is from here to here and it's completely irrelevant. What you need to buy a bike by is by the length of it. So you might think by the top tube length of a bike, yeah? Not really, because that's only applicable when you're sat down on the bike because of all the other angles. The one that counts is essentially a measurement from your bottom bracket shell to your handlebars. That is known as the reach. And to get that measurement, you draw a vertical line through your bottom bracket axle and you meet it with a horizontal line that goes to the center of the head tube there. That is the way to find out how a bike fits you when you're stood up. Stood up measurement is the one that really makes a difference on a mountain bike because after all the aggressive terrain and riding you do, you're stood up on that bike. That is the one that you need to understand. Thankfully, most modern mountain bikes use disc brakes on them and hydraulic ones to boot. So hydraulic brakes are a fully enclosed system with a reservoir at the lever, pushing fluid down to the disc brake caliper at the wheel end. Now, the disc brake caliper can come in 2-piston designs or 4-piston designs. 2 pistons tend to be much lighter, but they have less power. 4 pistons, quite a bit heavier, but loads more power. Now, I'm sure some of you might think, why would you not have more power on all bikes? Well, you can have too much power. If you were to put a 4-piston brake on a lightweight cross-country bike, you'll forever be locking up the wheels. And likewise, if you're a heavy rider, upwards of 200 pounds, and you're running a 2-piston brake, it just might not be quite powerful enough for you. Also, you can tune the feel of brakes with different brake pads and different disc rotor sizes. A larger disc rotor will offer you more power, A smaller disc rotor will offer you a lighter weight but less power. Now you can't just put a big rotor on a 2-piston brake and expect it to handle it. Yes, you will get loads more power, but as a result of that, the brake will get a lot hotter and then you get inconsistency in braking. That's basically what you need to know about the brakes. There's two major types of brake pads available to you. There's metal sintered pads and there's organic or resin pads. The resin ones have fibres suspended in resin, and the metal sintered ones are loads of metallic particles, essentially all compacted together. Now metallic pads take much longer to bed in, but they're much more powerful in the long term and they work excellently in all conditions, although they can be quite noisy. Whereas the resin and organic options, they tend to have a lot more bite initially, but they can overheat and you'll wear them out if you ride in wet conditions repeatedly. On top of that, you can also get brake pads like these Ice Tech ones that have metallic fins on them. The cool thing about this is they dissipate heat from the brake pad. When the brake pad can run at a cooler temperature, your braking is more consistently powerful. For the disc rotors themselves, they obviously come in a whole variety of different sizes, down to as small as 140 and as big as 220 millimeters. Now you get 2-piece designs and you get single-piece designs. The advantage of the single-piece designs are they're much cheaper to manufacture and they'll cost you less money. The downsides are they're not quite as good as the 2-piece designs that use an aluminium spider to separate the metal braking surface. The cool thing about this is it further dissipates heat away from the braking surface and away from the fluid on the inside of the brakes, which means more consistent power. Brilliant, but slightly more expensive. And there's two ways of mounting a disc rotor to your bike. The more traditional 6-bolt option, or the far simpler center lock system by Shimano. Now the center lock system uses a single locking nut, but it does need specific hubs. Okay, on to the wheels of the bike. Now traditionally on mountain bikes, they used to be 26-inch in diameter, but these days we're on 27.5 or 29-inch options. Typically the 27.5 will feel more agile and they'll definitely appeal to shorter riders, and 29-inch wheels will feel more stable and maybe slightly faster on rough terrain, but less responsive. But they will feel better for taller riders. You can even get bikes now with mixed wheel sizes, having a bigger wheel on the front and a smaller wheel on the rear. The advantages of this are, for example, on a downhill bike that has lots of wheel travel, you can get issues of clearance between the wheel and yourself. So if you're a shorter rider, having that smaller rear wheel can get you around this. All wheels revolve around the hub. It's the most important thing. So at the center of the hub, you have the axle. The axle itself comes in a number of different widths. Up front, it can be 100 or 110 millimeters wide. The axle itself can spin on bearings. They can either be traditional cup and cone style bearings, or they can be cartridge bearings, which are easily replaceable once you wear them out. The hub itself, the structure of it is based on the body of the hub and then the flanges at the side. The flanges are responsible directly for holding the spokes. With the rear hub, the measurements are a little bit different because you have to take into account that's where all the gears on the bike are. Traditionally, rear hubs used to be 135 millimeters wide. They then stepped up to 142, and we're now hovering at 148 millimeters. This is also known as boost on the rear. But there is another standard that's just creeping in, known as super boost, and this is 157. So the spokes are the center of the wheel, they're connecting the hub to the rim. Now the spokes come in a few different styles. You get straight gauge, you get double butted and triple butted. Straight gauge are the strongest, but also the heaviest. The butted options essentially just remove material off the spokes where it's not needed to save weight. Now you get two major types of spoke. You get those that are completely straight, or you get those with the J bend at the end, like these ones. You can also get bladed spokes, although they're more commonly seen with our skinny tarmac-loving friends over at GCN. Unlike road bikes that still quite often use main part of the rim surface to brake on, mountain bikes don't have that problem. So our rims look a lot nicer straight out, and they're available in two major materials, aluminium and carbon. Now, despite what you hear, there is no better option between the two. They're both suitable for very different riders and different types of riding. And I'll give you two examples. In cross country, you want a super light set of wheels. If you make a super light set of wheels out of aluminium, it can be very hard to make them strong enough and stiff enough. That is where carbon comes in. And the complete opposite could be said for downhill, where sometimes, because carbon can be immensely strong, they can almost be too stiff. And there needs to be an element of flex in the wheels so the rider can get traction. There's also the rim width to take into account. So a narrow rim is only going to be suitable for a narrow tyre, whereas a wide rim needs to give support to a bigger tyre. Just think, if you're going to run a nice big tyre, say a 2.4 on a narrow rim, you're going to end up with a bit more of a light bulb effect shape of the tyre. It's going to get more rounded. The tyre won't do what it's supposed to do. Whereas if you step out the bottom of the tyre a bit, give it a bit more support from that wider rim like it deserves, the shoulders of the tyre are going to do exactly what they need to do and cut into the terrain. Tyres, they all fundamentally share the same construction. They're all made from rubber and they all have the bead that holds them onto the rim, then they have the carcass design. Now in the carcass design you'll hear something called TPI referred to. That stands for threads per inch. A cross-country tyre, for example, will have a high thread per inch rate, let's say 120. That means they're very closely packed, very fine threads. Fine threads means it's going to be a very supple casing. Downhill tyres have the opposite. They have far less or far lower TPI, like 60, but those threads are going to be much thicker and more supportive, so it's a tougher tyre. Then it comes to the tyre tread design. You get loads of different options available, but at opposite ends of the spectrum, you'll get something like this, which has a very big, aggressive, open tread with a high stack height. Brilliant for really adverse, aggressive terrain, but a little bit slower when it comes to the sort of faster terrain. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a tyre for faster terrain, like this one, as you can see. And this one has a very low stack height and the knobbles are very close together. Super fast, but it's obviously going to get a bit more phased when it comes to more aggressive terrain. So lots of different options available and in lots of different compounds. Up to 4 different rubber compounds are available. Softer compounds mean more grip but lower speed. Harder compounds mean more speed and lower grip. Okay, so let's have a look at the suspension fork. At the top of the fork you have the steerer tube that runs on the inside of the frame and it's clamped by the stem. This is connected to the crown of the fork, which is connected to the upper legs. These upper legs are sometimes called stanchion tubes. The lower legs are sometimes called sliders. Now on the inside of a fork you have obviously 2 legs. One leg is normally your sprung leg, the other leg is your damping leg. Inside the sprung leg you can either have an air spring or you can have a coil spring, just like we showed you with the rear shock. In the other leg you have your damper unit. This will typically have a compression adjustment at the top of the fork and a rebound adjustment at the bottom. The compression can be adjusted to stop the fork moving around to your body weight, and it can also be adjusted to make sure it deals with all of the bump impacts that come up towards the rider. The rebound, just like on the rear of the bike, deals with the extension force or the extension speed of that fork. Now there's a few variants with suspension forks. You'll get anything from 80mm of travel up to 200mm of travel. Now on those bigger 200mm downhill style forks, they have an additional set of crowns at the top of the head tube for additional support needed to support a fork that big. When it comes to the transmission, it all starts with the cranks. Now the cranks rotate in the bottom bracket and there's 2 ways these can mount in a frame. Depending on the type of frame, you get threaded and you get press fit options. Now the crank itself is what drives that transmission via the chainring. Now you can have 1, 2 or 3 options. As you can see on my bike here, we have 1 option on there, which is known as a 1x. Now on the rear, you can have anything from around 9 gears up to 12, as you can see on mine. So this is known as a 1x12 system. And the key to a 1x12 or any 1x system really is in the chainring itself. As you notice, there's no derailleur there and there's no chain guide there to keep the chain on. It's all down to the profile of the teeth. Now as you look closely, you'll notice there's a slightly narrow and a wide alternating profile to these. It's known as the Dynamic Chain Engagement Plus system. The idea of these narrow and wide chainring teeth is that they fit directly into the chain, filling those narrow and wide voids. What this does is stop the chain moving around, which reduces friction in the drivetrain and it increases chain retention. A double win. Okay, so onto the chain. The chain has surprisingly few parts. You have the pins that run through the middle here. You have the rollers that go around those pins. That's where the lubrication needs to happen to make your chain run nice and smoothly. And you have the inner and outer plates, known as the male and female links on the chain. You also have the quick link system, which joins your chain in a hurry. That's a single use component, so it's worth carrying a spare one of those. Now also note, when you look super close on the chain here, you've got these little chamfered edges on the back edges of the chain itself. That is part of the Dynamic Chain Engagement Plus system, and that is why it's such a silent system in use. It's all about reducing the noise that reduces in turn the friction. This is your rear derailleur, also known as the rear mech on a bike. Now at the bottom here you have what's sometimes called pulley wheels. You can also call them guide wheels, or jockey wheels. The job of these is to put tension on that chain. You also have additional tension put on the Shimano MECH by having a clutch in here. The clutch, you can turn it on and off. Why would you want to turn it off? For ease of removing the wheel or making adjustments to that derailleur itself. Now, something quite cool that you will have heard about is Shadow Plus technology. That is essentially Shimano's system for making sure that the derailleur sits as inboard on the frame as possible. And this is more and more important these days because the wider frames get, the more outward bound your rear derailleur sits, and it's in the firing line from rocks. So by sitting it under the frame, it minimises the chances of clobbering it on that big bad rock. And now at the business end of the rear wheel, you have the cassette, sometimes known as the gears or the sprockets on the rear. This one has a massive range. It's got 12 gears, so it's a little 10 tooth at the small end and a 51 at the big end. That gives you a 510% gear range. That is enormous. Now, the cool thing about this, it has some technology called Hyperglide and Hyperglide Plus. There's a series of ramps in here and shaped teeth. Now, at a glance, you could look at them and think they're damaged, but they're specifically designed like this to pull the chain up onto the next sprocket and to hook it back down again when you're changing gears. That is super cool tech. And finally, the last part of the transmission, of course, is the shifter. Now, the shifter is mounted up in your cockpit on the handlebars, and it's mounted in a natural position under the bars. Now, this is the Shimano Rapid Fire system. The thumb lever sits by your thumb's natural resting position, and that changes into the lower gears. You'll also notice there's a secondary lever by the finger. This is for shifting into the higher gears. Now, all mountain bikes have indexed gears these days, which correlates to the fact that one click at the lever correlates to one gear changed at the derailleur end. It's a really intuitive system. You might also notice that the shifter shares the same mounting system as the brake lever. This is Shimano's iSpec system. Now, this is an option. You don't have to have this, but it does declutter your control area. Pedals are something that cause loads of confusion. Essentially, you have two major styles: flat pedals, which is literally a platform pedal, and clipless pedals. But the thing that's confusing are you actually clip into these with a cleat and the bottom of your shoe. Now, flat pedals are the more original style pedals. They're literally a platform pedal, but once upon a time you would have bolted toe clips and straps to them like our road riding friends used to. Now, Shimano worked out this was a pretty dangerous way of riding a mountain bike off-road, so they wanted to develop a clipless pedal, a way of being connected to the pedal but without having those toe clips on there. So this is where they developed the SPD pedal, which stands for Shimano Pedaling Dynamics. You can have a tiny little pedal like this with jaws on it, which connect directly to a cleat on the bottom of your shoe. Ergo, a clipless pedal. Well, there we go. There's the whistle-stop tour of MTB Jargon. Hopefully this video has explained some of those technical terms out there. If there's any you don't understand or any you want to know more about, let us know in those comments underneath. As always, thanks for checking out our content here on GMBN Tech, and there's probably going to be another couple of videos floating around. Feel free to give them a good old watch. See you later.